At 52, she didn't wake up one morning deciding to change her life. There was no dramatic argument, no sudden loss, no moment that demanded attention from the outside world. Everything looked the same as always. The house was quiet, the routine intact, the responsibilities waiting. But something inside her had shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a thought you try to ignore, but that refuses to leave. She had done what was expected of her for most of her life. She learned early how to be useful, reliable, and strong. She became someone others could depend on. She built a life around obligations, schedules, and other people's needs. And for a long time, that felt right. It felt necessary. It felt like purpose. From the outside, her life seemed stable. There was nothing obviously broken. She had a job that paid the bills, a home that functioned, relationships that, at least on the surface, made sense. People described her as capable, grounded, someone who had everything under control, and she agreed with them. She told herself she was fine, that this was just how life was supposed to feel at this stage. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped asking herself questions. She stopped noticing what she wanted, what she felt, what she needed. Not because she didn't care, but because there was always something more urgent. Someone else came first. There was always another responsibility, another adjustment, another compromise that felt easier than disrupting the balance she had worked so hard to maintain. Years passed like that, quietly, predictably. She learned how to silence discomfort and call it maturity, how to ignore longing and label it impractical. She told herself that wanting more was selfish, unrealistic, something for younger people who still had time to make mistakes. At her age, she believed, stability mattered more than desire. The moment everything changed wasn't loud. It didn't demand immediate action. It happened on an ordinary morning, sitting alone at the kitchen table. The coffee had gone cold without her noticing. The house felt unusually silent. She looked around at the familiar walls, the objects she had chosen years ago, the life she had built piece by piece. And suddenly, without warning, a thought surfaced. This doesn't feel like mine. The thought startled her, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt true. And once it appeared, she couldn't push it away. She tried to explain it to herself. She told herself she was tired, that everyone feels disconnected sometimes, that this was just another phase that would pass. But the feeling stayed. It followed her through the day. It showed up in quiet moments. It whispered when everything else went silent. With that thought came fear. Fear of what it meant. Fear of what she might have to face if she listened to it. At 52, starting over sounded irresponsible, even ridiculous. She had spent decades building this life. Walking away from any part of it felt like failure. She worried about judgment, about disappointing people, about being seen as ungrateful for a life others might envy. She questioned herself constantly. Was she being unfair? Was she imagining a problem that didn't exist? Shouldn't she just be content? After all, nothing terrible had happened. There was no obvious reason to want change. And yet, the absence of disaster didn't equal fulfillment. She began to realize that surviving wasn't the same as living. What frightened her most wasn't the idea of change, but the idea of staying exactly where she was for the rest of her life, of waking up 10 years later with the same quiet emptiness, only deeper, more settled. She imagined herself older, still putting herself last, still waiting for a better moment that never came. And that thought scared her more than the unknown ever could. She didn't announce a transformation. She didn't reinvent herself overnight. There were no bold declarations or dramatic exits. Her first step was almost invisible to everyone else. She started paying attention to her own reactions, to the things that drained her, to the moments when she felt most distant from herself. She began saying no in small ways, not out of anger or rebellion, but out of honesty. She allowed herself moments of silence without filling them with obligation. She questioned habits she had never examined before, not to judge them, but to understand whether they still belonged to her. There were days she felt guilty for this new awareness. Old patterns don't disappear quietly. She had spent so long measuring her worth by how much she gave, how much she endured, how little she asked for. Letting go of that identity felt uncomfortable, almost wrong. But underneath the discomfort, there was relief, a sense of space she hadn't felt in years. Slowly, her perspective began to shift. She realized that reclaiming her life didn't mean erasing the past or rejecting everything she had built. It meant stopping the habit of self-abandonment. It meant recognizing that her needs were not an inconvenience and her desires were not a threat to the people she loved. She didn't suddenly become fearless. Doubt still visited her often. Some days, the old voice returned, telling her it was too late, that she should be grateful and stay quiet. But now, there was another voice too, quieter, steadier, a voice that reminded her that time passing doesn't make a life yours. Choice does. At 52, she understood something she had never allowed herself to consider before. That fulfillment isn't about dramatic change. It's about alignment, about living in a way that feels honest, even if it's simple, even if it's unseen, even if no one applauds it. Her life didn't suddenly become perfect. Problems didn't disappear. Responsibilities remained. But the way she occupied her life changed. She was no longer just moving through it on autopilot. She was present, aware, connected in a way she hadn't been for a long time. And in that quiet awareness, she found something unexpected. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being resolved, but the kind that comes from no longer betraying yourself. Maybe starting over isn't about changing everything. Maybe it's about recognizing what was never truly yours to carry. Maybe it's about realizing that even after years of living for everyone else, there is still time to come back to yourself. Because sometimes the most powerful decision isn't loud or visible. Sometimes it happens quietly at a kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee when you finally allow yourself to admit the truth. And that truth can change everything. If this story resonated with you, consider staying with us. Subscribe to the channel to receive more stories like this. Stories about starting again, about rediscovering yourself, and about realizing that it's never too late. If you feel comfortable, like this video. It helps this message reach other women who may be in a similar place in life. And if you'd like a quiet reminder when a new story is released, turn on the notification bell. This space was created for reflection, honesty, and second beginnings. And you're welcome here.